Again, thanks so much for coming to our Understanding Your SAT Data webinar. We appreciate you coming this afternoon. For your presentation team today, Tammy Hilton will be your presenter today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm Heather Jenkins. I will be one of the moderators, and we have Annie Wallace who may be joining us as well this afternoon. So great, we'll get going. So first and foremost, we want to thank the New Hampshire Department of Education. They are the reason we can bring you these webinars. So we always like to make sure that you know that they are the ones that are sponsoring all of these. Just so you know, everybody is muted. Please ask questions. It's easier for me to take a peek at them in the Q&A, and I'll also check the chat. The Q&A comes to me and the chat goes to everybody. So I guess either one, but if you put them in the Q&A, I just tend to be monitoring that a little bit more closely. We will send an email out. You will get the link to the PD certificate, a recording of this webinar. There will be a link to that. You'll get the slide deck and all the great resources that Tammy has put together for this will all come in an email about 24 hours from now. So it'll be tomorrow afternoon that you will be getting that particular email. At the end, a quick survey will pop up. I think it's 4 or 5 questions. We're always welcoming feedback, so please make sure to take the time to fill that out so we know how to do better in the future and what you really liked about this webinar as well. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Heather. So I'm going to turn my camera off as well, just so that you can see the screen in full.
Amy, you're muted.
Thank you, Heather. Sorry about that. So I'm going to turn off my camera just so that everybody can see the screen in full. And what we're really hoping for today is that you're going to walk away with an understanding of what the content of the SAT is. We're also going to show you a couple different places where you can learn how and where to find these SAT results. And then in general, we're hoping that you walk away with some new knowledge about how to use protocols with your teams to analyze the SAT results and make instructional changes in your school. So we're going to jump right into the background. What's on the SAT? So here we can see the dates for the recent SAT that just passed. 2024 dates have not been released yet, but they are typically around the same time of year every year. The DOE does require that all kids in New Hampshire take the essay portion of the test with the SAT. There's some additional information here if you wanted to click when you get the slides tomorrow on that hyperlink. Anything in blue is going to be a hyperlink, and you can click to find out more information there. So this slide right here is just showing information for those of you that have students who are in needs of accommodations for the tests. All students will take the test digitally unless their IEP says otherwise. And then I've linked you down again on the bottom. You can see a couple of blue hyperlinks to full accommodations that you'll receive in the handouts as well when you get the email that Heather mentioned tomorrow, if you are interested in that. So I'm sure many of you have heard that College Board is changing the SAT coming up in 2024. So while there are some changes coming, it is important to note that as of right now, the plan is that the SAT is going to remain on a 1,600 point scale. And it is going to continue to test kids in the 3 skill-related areas around reading, writing, and math. There will still be a proctor. Going, digital obviously does not mean that kids are just going to be able to take it at home or whenever they want to. There will also still be a lot of testing security in place. And with that being said, some of the exciting new changes are that they are going to shorten the reading passages. So there's only going to be 1 question rather than multiple questions tied to each reading. The kids' progress is going to be saved. So in the event of a power outage or some sort of technology malfunction, when the kids log back in, they're going to be able to pick right up where they left off instead of having to start all over again, which is amazing. Kids are also going to get faster score reports. So rather than waiting, multiple weeks to months to get their results, kids are going to be able to get their score reports from the digital test in just a matter of days. The reports have typically in the past included their percentile rankings and the breakdown of their score. But they're also, in the upcoming changes, going to try to include information about four-year colleges, scholarship opportunities, along with expanded resources about local community colleges, workforce training certification options, and other career options for kids. So that's really exciting. And then again, the blue ink up at the top is just a hyperlink if you want to go read the article where I pulled all that information from. And then this just gives you sort of a visual change, or a visual of some of the changes in the timelines for them. So again, the switch is to hopefully make things easier for people, and to have it be more accessible to a lot of kids. And then they're also, College Board's just really trying to make things relevant and to help students better plan for their future as they do this, again, by offering some of those more personalized college and career guidance reports as well. Okay, so here's the breakdown of the SAT with some math questions. And so some math questions do require written responses. There is no penalty for guessing. It's really important to remind kids of that. So if they're not sure of an answer, it is better to guess than to leave a response blank. And then again, remember, even though it's not on here, New Hampshire does require an essay portion as well. And so, but that is scored separately, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So when we look at the scoring a little bit more, this is the specific breakdown of how it's calculated. So students get one total score comprised of the two big sections, the math and the English, which include both reading and writing. And then within those categories, science, history, and social studies information is embedded into the questions through what they call cross-test scores. And so then within all of those categories, there's even more specific subscores that you can see here in this image. So let's dive into the essay just a little bit. This is a breakdown of the essay. Again, it's scored separately from what we just talked about a minute ago. There is one prompt. The kids have one passage to read. It's typically about 650 to 750 words. In terms of text complexity, it's rated about a level 1. And then in terms of scoring, there's 2 scorers, and they rate, each one rates it on a 1 to a 4 scale. And they look at things like reading, analysis, and writing skills. And so this just talks about that a little bit more. The biggest thing that trips kids up when it comes to the essay is that they want to write their own opinion and their own thoughts. And that is not what the SAT essay asks for. It really asks them about the analysis of an author's craft and techniques. So I have linked you here to the full SAT rubric. It's really great to use SAT exemplars for kids, which will also be part of that folder that you receive tomorrow that Heather mentioned. And I would suggest that maybe your teams do a writing calibration to see if you line up in regards to your writing expectations as a grade level or content area or district to what the SAT is asking for. And if nothing else, it's a really great, calibration exercise just in general about, what we are looking for as a staff for writing. For this though, going back to the SAT essay, kids are really required to make purposeful use of text evidence. That's what they're really looking at and thinking about, can they evaluate and analyze a passage that an author develops objectively, and be able to use claims to support that. So this is an example of a writing passage. Okay, so this one happens to be written by Eric Kleinberg in 2013. This, again, you'll have in your handout section, the full version of this, but it comes from Time magazine. And really it's arguing about how Americans use or abuse the use of air conditioning when the heat temperatures rise. And so he, meaning Kleinberg, the author, is really arguing in this article that every American, whenever the temperature rises to a specific level, instead of using, they're not using air conditioning properly. It's really like hurting the environment, it's hurting the electric bills, et cetera. So kids have to think about this. And then here's the prompt that they get. So, thinking about that, they have to think about Kleinberg and his argument and, things that he puts in the text to support, their analysis of his reports. And you can see right down bottom, again, it says to the kids, you should not explain whether you agree with his claims, but rather how he builds an argument to persuade his audience. And so again, this is really where kids get tripped up because they just want to go with their own opinion. So that's really important to think about. And if you don't do any, writing prompt, think about the writing prompts that kids get throughout their high school day with you, whether it be in science or social studies or English, maybe give them some prompts to get them used to this structure of writing, because we are so good at asking kids to write, their opinion and support their own opinions with things, but really think about giving them some even mini prompts about where they have to analyze an argument based on someone else's to get them into this. All right, so the reading passages, there are typically 5 passages on the reading test. 4 are standalone, and then 1 is usually a paired passage that kids have to read together. The standalone passages and the paired ones are both typically about 500 to 750 words, and they tend to be drawn from a lot of content area documents. So while the test is really focused on reading, writing, and math, a lot of the content is focused on your science and social studies areas. So one passage typically comes from a work of fiction. 1 or 2 will come from some sort of historical document, like the Constitution or something like that. 1 typically focuses on, topics such as freedom or justice or human dignity. I know one time in one of the examples, a speech by Nelson Mandela was used. Then 1 passage will typically have a work around topics of economics or sociology or psychology. And then finally, there'll be a couple of very specific scientific pieces. So something around biology or chemistry or physics or earth science or something. And so when the kids read these, they're typically asked about 3 broad categories. So they're asked again how the author uses evidence. So questions might be things like identify part of a passage that supports the point the author is making, or find evidence in a passage that best supports the answer to a previous question. The second thing the SAT really looks at in these is understanding words in context. So here's where your vocabulary really comes into play. And so these are thinking about things about, author's choice of words and how those words shape meaning and style, or the tone, or things like that. And then finally, sort of the third broad category that the SAT reading test is looking at is the analysis of those history, social studies, science questions, right? So these are going to really require kids to draw on reading skills that they would need to succeed in those subjects. So it might ask them things like to interpret data, to consider implications, to examine a hypothesis. And so these, are really important for kids to have, and really thinking about what's implied in the passage and not just relying solely on their background knowledge. It's really passage specific. So here's here's an example of a reading passage. So this one's from a short story. And it's really about this electrician who lives off an influential man and really helps him slow down like this revolution of the meter. And so when kids are looking at this, or when you're looking at this as a teacher, I want you to really think about, what might be hard for students to do in this in order for them to be successful. So really look at the structure of this passage, think about or notice the vocabulary terms that are in this passage here. Think about the importance of background knowledge if kids were reading this. I know that it's, online. So think about the impact of that for kids, if they had to read this on paper versus them doing it online, which is the way that they do it. And I say this only because it's these questions that are going to get you thinking about strategies to help kids be successful readers in general, not just, teaching to the test, for example. And so this passage, again, happens to be a short fiction story, but some of the reading passages are nonfiction based in those content areas that we just talked about. So these are 3 questions that are based on that previous passage. They are all multiple choice, and they typically tend to be, but again, they're really looking at different categories here. So this first one is focused on author's purpose. Then we're focused on vocabulary, and then we're focused on the author's craft of imagery. And so we want to make sure that we're teaching those skills in our classes, and, the kids are getting exposed to them throughout their high school day, and that they have multiple opportunities to practice engaging in that thinking and application process that's going to help them be successful with this. And for those that are wondering with this one, question 1C is the best choice. And for question 2B is what they're looking for. And then question 3D, as in dog, is what they are looking for in terms of the correct answer. All right. So then there's also writing and language passages on the SAT. Again, these are different than when we talk about the essay portion of the SAT. And so there are typically 4 passages on the test. They're typically about 400 to 450 words each. The complexity of these varies. Some are really challenging. Some are pretty straightforward. So it kind of depends. And this new test that's coming, I think I forgot to mention this, is supposedly going to also be adaptive. So in theory, when kids take this next year and those changes have gone into effect, as kids get things right, the complexity is going to increase. And as kids get things wrong, the complexity is going to decrease to kind of match like how they're scoring. So these passages, again, tend to be around some of your content area stuff. So they could be passages about different things with careers or science or humanities or social studies, all those sorts of things. And one is typically going to be a narrative passage, meaning it's going to read more like a story. And then the other passages are going to be argumentative or persuasive. And then some are going to be informative. So kids are going to get sort of all 3 of the big genres out there. And then some passages, again, because we're also looking at the skills for the content areas, they're going to require things or skills that kids are going to need to like look at charts or graphs or infographics and then make interpretations or analysis or things like that. So typically each passage has about 11 multiple choice questions. They're really looking at things like expression of ideas and then, the development of ideas, grammar and language usage, organization, and again, those like standard language conventions. So looking for things like run-on sentences, incomplete sentences, things like that. So on the writing and language tests, kids might be asked to make corrections in passages or to correct a description or an explanation of a graph or a table. These are created especially for the test so that they can intentionally introduce errors to kids to really see if kids can pick up on it. These passages tend to be several paragraphs long so that kids can really engage in like complex real world revision and editing tasks, and also to make sure that students have a good understanding of, one or more paragraphs in regards to a particular question. And then here's an example from one of those. So again, I want you to think about the structure, as you were looking at some of those passages and some of these questions, thinking about the structure, think about what might be difficult for students to understand in terms of the passage, the structure, the setup, or in terms of the questions and the way that the questions are written, and how those are set up for kids. Because even in their multiple choice, it's really hard to decipher the difference between some of the choices. A lot of times kids will look at this and they'll be like, I don't even know, like B, C, and D all look the same. But for those that are wondering, question 1 here, they want D as in dog. They're saying is the best choice because a comma is needed to separate what they're calling the main independent clause from the dependent clause that describes the lake. And then for question 2, they're saying that A is the best choice because the comma is correctly used to separate the introductory dependent clause from the independent clause that follows it. All right, so math. This is a reference tool that is provided to SAT test takers from the College Board. Typically, no other notes are allowed. So this is something that College Board gives the kids that they can use throughout. This is part of your handouts packet, but this is really the only thing kids can use on the math test. So the math test has 2 parts. There's a non-calculator portion and a calculator portion. Both of them are multiple choice, but some questions are open-ended, and then they ask the kids to write the answer in, which is called grid ins, and we're going to look at those in just a minute. And again, the kids can use those everyday formulas that are provided to them. And then, to succeed after high school, it is important for kids to know how and when to use a calculator. So I always used to tell my kids, the calculator, like any other tool, is only as smart as the person using it, right? And so while you can use a calculator on some of the math questions, for some of the kiddos, it might almost be best if they don't, right? Because for some kids, they spend more time trying to get the calculator to work or trying to, plug the information into the calculator or whatever than they do just actually thinking about and formulating the answer to the question. And so it's really getting them to think about that balance of, their ability to use the calculator. And in these cases, it's really students who can make use of their structure or ability to reason are probably going to finish before the kids who actually use the calculator, right? So really, it's like a security blanket, but just keep that in mind. And then in some portions, again, there's just no calculator allowed because they really want to look at the fluency of math for kids and understanding like the math concepts in their number sense. So this is an example of what that grid in looks like on the SAT. Although most of the questions are multiple choice. 22% are student produced response questions. So this is what they're calling the grid in. So instead of choosing the correct answer from a list of options, they need to solve problems and then enter their answers into a sheet. And then this is another skill in and of itself that kids have a really hard time with, making sure that they can answer it correctly and things like that. This, I'm not sure if they'll have these on the new versions or not that are coming, but as of right now, this is like what kids had. So when we think about math a little bit more, it's broken down into 4 areas that College Board really feels address college and career success. So whether kids go to college or out in the careers, these are like the 4 big areas. So heart of algebra, and we're going to break all these down a little bit more, but basically heart of algebra is looking at the focus and mastery of linear equations and systems. Problem solving and data analysis is really looking at the ability to analyze problems and draw information from data. And then Passport to Advanced Math is questions that have kids manipulate complex equations. And then there's a couple sort of additional math topics that are thrown in there. So these could include things like geometry or trigonometry, which are most relevant to college and career readiness. But again, we're going to break these down. So Heart of Algebra, we just said it focuses on linear equations. But it's also looking at functions and systems of linear equations. So these questions might ask kids to create equations that represent a specific situation, to solve them, whether it be the systems of equations or just straight out equations, and to also make connections between different representations and linear relationships. Problem solving and data analysis. These are where your ratios, your percentages, your proportional reasoning to solve problems in real world situations all come into play. And again, they might include science, social studies, or other related context around their questions, because it's really helping kids describe relationships shown between like a graph or some sort of statistical data to an equation. And so this is really getting at those, not just college courses, but like career training programs and sometimes just everyday life skills that kids need. And then Passport to Advanced Math was your other big one. And so this is really going to focus on things like economics or career opportunities in the STEM fields. And so this is going to have kids, require them to have familiarity with complex equations or functions, as well as like calculus or statistics or other sort of advanced courses. And then again, there's, up to 6 questions and additional math topics. 3 typically tend to be in the non-calculator section and 3 typically tend to be in the calculator section. And then these are going to include topics like geometry, trigonometry, radian measure, and complex numbers. And then these are examples from the non-calculator portion of the test. So these are things that kids are going to have to solve in that non-calculator portion. And for all those who are wondering, I did include the answers here, and we won't go over them in depth, but they are here for you to go back and look at your leisure once you get the slideshow. And same thing, here's some more of those answers. This is a calculator section. So again, as you look at these, just like we did with the ELA, whether we're looking at calculator or non-calculator, I want you to think about, what background knowledge kids need to have, thinking about what your current scope and sequence of units looks like and the skills that this is requiring, and thinking about, what skills are they going to have? What skills might they be missing? What's hard for them in terms of the question, in terms of the answers, and just, as you set up problems of the day or entry activities or exit tickets, you might think about structuring things to give kids multiple opportunities to work with skills and reasoning and analysis like this that they might need. And then here's a question, and I just put this in here so that you could see like what's correct, what's not correct, and why they deem it necessary. So these again are just here for your leisure. And then when we're going to talk about where to find your SAT data here in just a moment, but when we think about tracking SAT data and using it to inform our instruction, it is really imperative because this data, whether it's PSAT or SAT, it can be really indicative as to how successful students are going to be after high school, again, whether they move into college or some sort of career or certificate training program, this research does show us that it's really indicative. So it is important to think about. And then here again, it's just more information about what these benchmarks are and the probability of success for them. And then finally here, I've just linked you, these are all hyperlinks that you'll have access to for PSAT or SAT. And you can go through, if you have a College Board account, it's free. You can go in there, you can print off paper things, you can, have kids practice online if you want. You can go in as educators and do this for your own instruction and thinking about strategies and skills kids need to be successful. Again, not just on the SAT, but just in your classes in general, and helping them transfer and apply their knowledge. So we are not teaching to a test. We are teaching skills and strategies. We're using our content, and we're really thinking about that transfer of knowledge, which in the end is the ultimate goal of why we do what we do as teachers, right? And then I often have, when I go into schools and I work with schools about SAT or PSAT data and you know, using this to inform our instruction, a lot of teachers will say to me, well, what is it like as a, you know, what's the student testing experience like? And so I've actually linked you to a thing here that you can go on and see what it's like as a student to take the SAT. All right, so I'm going to pause there and just see, Heather, are there any questions that have come up?
I don't have any questions yet.
All righty, great. Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to talk just briefly about where to find your SAT data. There's a couple of places you can go. So the first one is iPlatform. And so here you can view lots of different types of data, but you can also look at aggregate section scores. You can compare your school to other New Hampshire schools. You can also look at different variables like socioeconomic status, EL populations, you know, total revenue. There's just, it's a wealth of data knowledge. And so here is just one example of a score report from iPlatform, looking at those different subject areas, I'm sorry. And the science is on here because that is your New Hampshire SAS. So that's why you see science on here. And then for SAT, the state, you know, divides the data into 4 levels, just like on the SAS for accountability purposes. So we can see that here. And then the DLM is a special education modified assessment. But this, you probably, for many of you, you may not even like need to use this because this is a very rare circumstance. And then this is a page where you're going to be able to track those trends over 3 years worth of time. So here, because we're talking 3 years ago, you know, this included 2020, which nothing happened, no testing occurred, but if it had, it would be there. And as we continue, you know, that will get pushed out, 2023 will appear, and then so on and so forth. But it's nice to look at 3-year data, whether you're looking at SAS, which Heather does a lot of work with schools around, or SAT. It is very informative.
Yeah, just to clarify there too, when you're looking at the ELA and the math, it is a combination of the ELA and math from New Hampshire SAS for your overall school or district and the SAT. So some of the information is in there together, and then other times you'll be able to use a little arrow that you'll be able to look at a little bit more detailed. Anything for ELA and math for 11th grade is your SAT data.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather. So this is also a good reference tool in regards to your graduation and attendance rates. Again, allowing you to track patterns and trends over 3 years worth of time. And I put this in here because tracking historical data, even these things here, can be a really good predictor of future data on assessments, whether it is the SAS or the SAT or whatever. Because everything, as we all know, intertwines with each other. So and then this is just another view of sort of more of a holistic thing. So again, you can see your student achievement scores, but then you can also see other things that might impact, you know, either student data or cohorts of kids, or even just, you know, schools in general. So that is there. And then this is breaking it down a little bit more. This is usually like the first page you'll see once you log into iPlatform. And so you can see here the name of any school and sort of pick the different tabs and go through here to find your data. And then this is a more holistic view of all of those things that we just looked at in terms of the breakdown that you can see in iPlatform. And then again, a holistic view here of like where you can find these. which tab they're under, and then how you can compare overall, and just kind of seeing like the state versus your district versus your specific school. If you are a district that has more than one high school in it, this is really helpful information. So that's iPlatform. If you want to look just at College Board SAT specific, this is where you would go. So I will say, put a disclaimer out there, that it is really important that districts allow teachers and educators to have access to College Board. It should not be just administrators and or your school counselors, because ultimately we're hoping that it's the teachers who are going to use the data to inform their instruction. And so therefore they're the ones that are going to need to access it. And there really is a lot of invaluable information for them to use as individual teachers, as grade levels, as content areas, et cetera. And I know when Heather and I go into schools and we work with high schools specifically on their SAT data, that is the first thing we request from the technology people or the admins, is that everybody has access to this data, because it is so important to be able to do data dives and different things. So when you log into College Board, this is the page that you're going to see, and there's different ways that you can search for specific reports. So you can choose student names, you can let the portal choose for you, you can look at summary reports, things like that. So we're going to break these down a little bit more, but this is just sort of the general opening page. And then you're going to choose the type of test and the date that you want. Remember, school day is the official New Hampshire state assessment, and that's when the data is pulled for accountability. And it's usually the best data to use because all of your kids have taken it that day. So this is what a school counseling office would use. If you're a school counselor, you're familiar with this, but otherwise you don't need to worry about this roster report. It's probably the only report you won't look at as a classroom teacher. This report here, it's the scores and benchmark report. This is a really good way to get a quick picture of how you might compare to the overall state. And again, if you are a school in a district that has more than one like high school in it, you can also see the different breakdown here. And then once you click on that, you know, this is where you would see all of your data in terms of average scores and benchmarks and, you know, the breakdown of things. You can also have the ability to print batches of questions from the question analysis reports. So you can select one or more questions here, and then you can print all question contents or just print question and answer choices. It's totally up to you. And so you would start here. You could search by a certain percentage of correct. So if you wanted to see only things that were 25% correct and below, you could click that. You could have all of them clicked. It's up to you. Here you can search by difficulty to analyze questions. So if you want to look at just all of the medium questions that kids are getting right or wrong, or all the easy ones, or the difficult ones, this is where you would do it. You can also search by cross tests and subscores. So this is where your content areas come into play as well. So you can see that here by the drop-down menu. And then you also have the option and or the ability to download your data into an Excel spreadsheet if you are a school that uses Excel. So again, here, this school chose to only look at medium level questions for kids that scored below the 50th percentile. And so you can really batch and like look at kids that way as well. So so when we think about the question analysis report, we really want to use this to understand what each question reveals about student learning. So you might consider whether students struggle with particular types of questions. You are going to be able to diagnose errors in student choices by understanding some of the distractors. You might use this to redefine your instruction and address areas of weakness. If you do search by the difficulty indicators, you know, this is going to help you think about areas where students are exposed to this type of content in class and throughout the day. And then again, really think about skill reinforcement areas in science or social studies, you know, so really look at those things related to those cross-test scores. And again, thinking about those multiple opportunities for kids throughout their day. So, you know, students are struggling with all types of questions. This may indicate that they're not being exposed to those specific skills or content enough. It might lead to a curriculum review. For some schools, that's been really helpful. If students are struggling with difficult questions, you might collaborate with other teachers to determine how to play with that level of complexity for kids. If you are thinking about those cross test scores and sub-scores, you might look for connections among the questions and the scores to identify the areas of focus for interventions or supports, or even do a curriculum review of your science and social studies contents. So there's all kinds of different things that you can do with this. It's pretty phenomenal. This is the instructional planning report. This is a great report because you can look at your school in comparison, again, to another one in the district or the state. It's also going to allow you to see your students within each performance group, as noted in the blue text under the red sections. And then if you are wondering what those colors mean, I know they're probably pretty intuitive. We're pretty used to red, green, yellow, but green are the kids who are meeting or exceeding the benchmark. Kids that are in yellow, they're not meeting, but they're really close. They're like within 1 year's growth. And then any kids that are in red, they are more than a year's growth below the grade level benchmark. So that's what those mean. And then a growth report is really great because it can allow you to track growth of a cohort. So if you are a district, so you can give the PSAT as low as 8th grade. You can also start it in 9th grade. But what this is going to allow you to do is really track that cohort of kids as they take the PSAT, their 8th, 9th, and 10th grade year, and then their SAT, and really project their, achievement on future administrations of things. So if you did have a PSAT, it would show up here, and it would be pretty great to track kids. And then again, same thing, just a different way to look at it. If you want to think about, how kids in a specific cohort are doing, how they might do in the future, and then what this means for kids and their achievement. So we are going to talk about protocols to look at this data now. So these are the types of teams that you may want to think about assembling when it comes to looking at different types of data. So your district team is really going to think about patterns and trends across the district, both horizontally and vertically. And they're also the ones that are really in charge of the accountability protocols. A school leadership team also has accountability protocols to make sure that they are looking, following while they look at patterns and trends at the school level. And then they're going to disseminate that information to all stakeholders. But PLC teams, you are all the ones that are going to be comprised of like those grade level or content areas. And you are going to be thinking about SMART goals that are going to drive your instruction. And so this is an example of a data-driven protocol that can be used by any one of those data teams. And we will break these down a little bit further, but basically phase 1 is all about predictions. Phase 2 is about just observing the data itself. Phase 3 is where your interpretations and your inferences are going to come into play. Phase 4 is going to be, okay, now that we've done all this, what does this mean for our practice? Like, what are we going to do about it? And then phase 5 is your reflection, thinking back to like what went well, what didn't go well and why. And so again, we're going to break all of these down in just a second. And then this is a note-taking sheet, may be helpful for some of you as you go through that. You do have a copy of this coming your way if you choose to use it. So here's a closer look at phase 1. Again, it's all about predictions. The key to this is that it is done at the very beginning and it's done silently to really make sure that all members of the data team can really think and process their predictions before hearing what everyone else thinks. And so this allows everyone's voice to be heard through writing and conversation so that you can really make sure everyone's voice is heard in multiple ways. Phase 2, this is the phase where you have to just stick to the facts. This is probably the most difficult one. I know Heather and I do a ton of data dives with schools, whether it's with SAT or New Hampshire SAS. And this is a tough one. This one has no because. This one is just focused on what the data is saying, the patterns, the trends, things that are surprising. but again, there is no because. That can come here in this, in the next phase. This one wasn't part of the cycle, but sometimes it is helpful to just put a quantifying amount to things. But, really just thinking about what you're looking at. So what I really want to encourage you to do is use the data to inform your instruction. Again, not just as 11th grade teachers, but for all teachers to really look at progress and growth in order to inform instructional practices across an entire school, an entire team, or cohorts of kids. So administrators and guidance, again, make sure you allow all teachers to access the data so that you can use it, because for many high schools, the SAT is one of the only pieces of data that you have that is universal and or nationally normed. High school is tough. Like, we don't have a lot of the other assessments that a lot of the other schools have. So this is a big one. So phase 3, this is, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna add a little bit to that, where I feel like a lot of schools have gotten into thinking that the SAT is just for kids who are going to college. And Tammy had mentioned a couple of the changes that are going to be going on that have like career readiness, different types of colleges that students might look at. It is not just for kids going to college. I just want to remind everybody, and Tammy and I always make sure that folks know that this is your only accountability measure for students that are in high school. So besides this and the New Hampshire SAS for science in 11th grade, these are your accountability measures for the state. So I know that we have kind of shaped our thinking into saying like, oh, this is just for the kids that are getting ready for college. It's no big deal. Colleges aren't going to be, asking for, SAT scores. So many of them are test optional. But just a reminder at how important this particular assessment is for everybody, regardless of whether students are going to college or not. Again, for accountability purposes, even if the SAT went away completely, the state of New Hampshire would find another assessment that would then be used for accountability purposes in high school. So I just wanted, as you were saying, Tammy, about the fact that we really want to be using this might be the only, common assessment that you have in high school for some folks. I just wanted to make sure to add that on.
Yeah, no, that's so important, Heather. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind. And I know when I go into high schools to do data dives, like I don't just do it with 11th grade teachers. It's really important that, the whole team is there, all contents are represented, all grade levels are represented, because again, this data is one of your only points of data that you may have. And it really helps schools look at those patterns and those trends and really think about their curriculum. I have had some schools that have said, wow, we really need to think about our scopes and sequences, or we really need to think about, the curriculum that we're teaching kids and how much, we're exposing them versus like, oh, we just teach them about, the Civil War or the Holocaust every year since the time they enter 6th grade. And that's the only thing we touch upon. Maybe we need to change that. So it is really valuable. And I think that's so important what you just said, Heather. So thank you so much. Okay, so then phase 3, this is really important because this is the part where that data cycle, or within that data cycle, that we begin to think about why. Why is our data this way? If you look at a 3-year trend and your kids, are always scoring like really low or really high, why? There's a reason for that. And so thinking about what the data is telling you and what it's not telling you is really important in helping you determine the answers to those things. And then phase 4, this one is all about your action. So you, at this point, you have predicted, you've observed, you've come up with some inferences or possible explanations, but now you and your team really need to think about, okay, what's next? What are we going to do? So putting some action steps in place. So thinking about, does it make sense to analyze items associated with students in the lowest performing area? Thinking about what can we learn about the things kids are just omitting? Thinking about similarities between items that kids score really poorly on. looking at, is there a group of students where a specific intervention or alternative course of structure might be needed? Or thinking about, does there need to be a schedule around a certain, when certain subjects are taught, or scopes and sequences or things like that. So phase 4, super important, all about action. This could also be part of your phase 4. Many teachers have to set SMART goals anyway for observational purposes, but it's also really nice to think about SMART goals in regards to your instruction and the impact they can have on students. And based on data specifically. And then here's an example of a SMART goal using SAT data. You can use the Common Core as a guide if needed, but we can see here a school set a specific SMART goal based on their student performance and the action steps that they're going to put in place to try to work towards the goal that they set. And then the blue here is a hyperlink to an example of a template where you can fill out the year-long SMART goal, the action steps, all of the things that are needed. I've also put some things here that that you might consider either in your action planning or just what you might do. And then this is a visual of what that hyperlink will look like for you. And this again goes back to creating accountability for all stakeholders. And then we looked at that red, green, yellow chart a few minutes ago. You can also use that to set SMART goals. So again, this is the instructional planning report that we discussed earlier, and we can see like a current situation and then how a school is saying, okay, this year, this is where we're at, but like by the time the kids take this again, here's where we need to go. And then this is just another example of a template that you may or may not find helpful in determining progress, but it really, it will be in your handout folder that you get tomorrow. And it just is a different way of like looking at this. And then finally, just another resource for you. We love to give you resources. And so this will just help you break down your SMART goals specifically, which some schools find really, really helpful. Okay, so any final questions before we end? I know I've thrown a lot of information out there at you. So I just want to pause here and just see if anyone has any questions.
I don't have any in the chat or in the Q&A. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Heather.